Good morning, Amnon. How are you? It's such a pleasure to meet with you. Almost 15 years ago, we nearly started working together on history and the Bible. You have history, I have the Bible. Many beautiful things grow when history and the Bible come together. And you are tireless. And you called on me to join the new B'nai Noah project, which is an amazing thing because the Bible is a book that the whole world loves, the whole world learns from it. And every connection between history and the Bible, every connection with the Bible, which is not just a religious book, but a book that offers deep insights into history, is something the whole world can engage with. So it's really enjoyable to talk with you in Jerusalem on a Friday while you're in Samaria, which is flourishing and thriving. We're actually speaking within prophecies. Within the prophecy of old men and women will once again sit in the streets of Jerusalem. And you are within the prophecy of they will once again plant vineyards in the hills of Samaria. It's such a pleasure to broadcast to the whole world from within prophecy. Who would have believed that we would merit this? So I wanted to talk to you today about history in the Bible in a contemporary context. Today, the world is very, very global. We are part of global processes. And I wanted us to talk about that, whether it's connected to the Bible, whether it's not connected to the Bible, and what can be done with it. What do you think?
Let me ask you a question, maybe to see how this question develops. The world is changing before our eyes. This is most evident in the Middle East. Syria is a lesson. Hezbollah is growing, Russia, Ukraine, and more. Suddenly, new players are also getting involved there. Houthis from Yemen, and who knows where Israel is headed, and there are snakes all over the world, this and that. And the opening question is whether we can draw conclusions from the Bible about these kinds of processes that are happening.
It seems that the Bible doesn't say Threads, it doesn't say Trump, and it doesn't say Netanyahu. But in the Bible, you have an amazing toolbox. The Bible is like someone giving you a glimpse into the workspace of the world's manager. He shows you projects, what we would call today the Creator's past projects. And the Bible is full of projects that this Creator, the Holy One, blessed be He, has done in the world. And to the prophets, He revealed His system of considerations, His working mechanism. If I wanted to go for a job interview with someone and wanted to understand what they're going to do tomorrow, what I would do is look at the previous projects they've done. And He revealed to us His systems of considerations. That would give me some input, a few tools to work with about how He works, what He thinks. It is written in the book of Amos, for the Lord God does nothing without revealing His secret to His servants, the prophets. This verse in the book of Amos is specifically talking about global events happening in His time. Assyria is spreading through the Middle East, and Amos tells the people, you are looking for the interpretation of your events in the wrong places, in geopolitical and economic contexts. But actually, the deeper interpretation of these events is found in prophecy, because the one who truly manages these events is the Holy One. Blessed be He.
And prophecy. What you're saying is amazing. So it means that you're able to learn from the Bible and get explanations for where all these processes originate, if I understand correctly what you said. If it's written in the Bible, you can approach the Bible as a written book, draw from it those mechanisms from which you can reach conclusions and better understand what happens in the world at times.
Yes, I'm just emphasizing, in my opinion, it's a toolbox. It's not a one-to-one correspondence.
And you see, sometimes maybe you can explain what you mean by a toolbox.
A toolbox means that if I saw that the Assyria project, God managed with certain considerations, and the Persia project, He managed with other considerations, and the project of the 4 and 5 kings, the story of Lech Lecha, He managed with yet other considerations. So I become familiar with the system of considerations that God presents to us in the management of the world.
After all, if someone wants, so in order to understand, sorry for interrupting you, to walk them through project by project so we can understand exactly what this is about and how it's done.
All right, I'm just finishing the point that if I want to know, Trump is a very, very unpredictable person. People really want to know what he's planning. So what do? They look into his entire history. He's an older man. He's done a lot of things in his life. What are the patterns? And then every time you read in the newspaper, this commentator says that Trump is impulsive, that he's like this and like that. How does he know that? Because he saw it from past projects. So if we look through the lens that the wisdom of Kabbalah opens up for us regarding global events, we can examine and see some principles, and we'll have a sort of training ground. And truly, I feel that when the current process began, when Trump came to power a few months ago, so we studied chapters from the Bible here, and some of the things, the processes were pretty transparent from the start, what happened, what was going to happen. So let's get into some examples. The Bible is, first and foremost, a very, very global book. It's true that the Bible is a book with the people of Israel at its center, but actually, almost never, maybe never are the Israelites a process that stands alone. And this is a common mistake among many lovers of Israel. They think that because Israel is the center of the Bible, if a process is divine, it must relate specifically to Israel. And the exact opposite is true. The book of Genesis is a book that is entirely filled with global processes. Even before there is Abraham, our forefather, before there is the people of Israel at all, there are global processes whose principle is very simple. This is obvious. I don't think I'm saying anything new here. The Bible teaches us that history is managed by a force that wants good in the world, and in the end removes the evil and brings about good. This is not something to be taken for granted. Humanity, for example, experienced a great crisis called the flood. And the flood is something that the whole world experienced and the whole world refers to it. And when you dig in the area of Syria, what used to be Syria, you find ancient writings that describe the flood. So how did humanity interpret the flood? And this is amazing. People interpreted the flood as a quarrel between gods, or as gods who were disturbed by humanity. And so they poured water so that it wouldn't make noise, like when you have a neighbor who makes noise at noon. You find the laziest way to pour water on them. What is at the root of this interpretation? At the root of this interpretation lies the perception that the world is run by dark forces stronger than us. It's an amazing thing. In the ancient pagan system, the gods would take women from one another. In other words, the forces that run the world are themselves very primal, very evil forces. They take women from each other. This immediately dictates how humanity behaves. What happens? If your gods take women from each other, then so do you. If the strong take the women of the weak, then the sons of God awakened in the daughters of man and took for themselves wives from whomever they chose. In other words, if the world is run, and anyone familiar with the mythological systems, the Canaanite, Ugaritic, Greek, Egyptian, they're all the same. The world is run by a system of violent dark forces. You have to get along with them. Obviously, a humanity that grows up with such a worldview will continue to conduct itself according to that same worldview. And then, if there is a flood, you might interpret it as, yes, just another quarrel among the gods, each one wanting to take something from someone weaker than himself. The Bible comes and tells us, swell up. The flood comes as a response to this. The sons of God saw the daughters of man, and then the Holy One, blessed be He, becomes angry, and then there's a flood. That is to say, even a natural disaster as global and all-encompassing as the flood is, in the end, part of a divine movement whose mechanism is directed toward a better world. That's the basic premise.
Now, if I remember correctly, when the land was filled with violence, there were also other phenomena, whether mentioned in the scriptures or not, that angered the Holy One, blessed be He, and then the flood came upon the earth.
Which is the same thing.
It's not just the conflict between the gods, but actually happening.
That's exactly what I'm saying. The Jewish perspective teaches the world a mechanism that's completely the opposite. That is, if you have a pagan perception, then even when a global disaster happens, you associate it with your violent perception. But the Torah comes and teaches the opposite. The purpose of this is to remove the world from violence, to save the world from the greatest form of violence, which is when the sons of God take the daughters of man. Now, you and I both know that humanity did not learn its lesson. Until the people of Israel came along, humanity did not learn its lesson. The fact that we find writings, for example, about the Knights of Gilgamesh, which describe the flood as a violent event and not as a moral one, means that the nations who interpreted the flood this way continued to behave violently. And this is also something that is written in the Bible. We know this. When Abraham wanders around the Middle East after the flood, not many years after the flood, he knows that everywhere the big boss, the local king, can take his wife for himself. This is a custom that even the Greeks continued many, many years after the flood. That is to say, the Bible actually goes around and presents a different perspective. If we want to sum up in a few words what Abraham did on a global scale, then after thousands of years of history, King David wants to summarize what Abraham did on a global scale. He says, and they wandered from nation to nation, from one kingdom to another people. He did not allow anyone to oppress them, and he rebuked kings for their sake, saying, do not touch my anointed ones, and do my prophets no harm. In other words, what is Judaism, the first stage of Judaism? It goes around the world. Abraham, our forefather, goes from place to place and tells the kings, stop, you don't take someone else's wife. This is essentially the first struggle over the interpretation of a global event. Abraham, our forefather, goes from place to place and says, there is a God in the world, and he brought a flood because you took other people's wives, or if someone takes your wives, whoever they choose and do that, if you do that, you'll get a lesson. Pharaoh got a lesson, Abimelech got a lesson. Truly, the very first thing, Abraham calls out in the name of God. But sometimes we perceive it as if Abraham is calling out in the name of God, like to make a distinction, like a priest calling out in a church. No, Abraham, our forefather, teaches people how to look at their own history. That is how you call out in the name of God. And that is also the importance of our conversation. To call out in the name of God is not to call out in a synagogue. To call out in our house of prayer, to call out in the name of God is to interpret history in the name of God. And Abraham, our forefather, and here we come to a global event that takes place in the days of Abraham, our forefather, a world war. The pre-First World War, the war of the four angels and the five. Now here, in order to understand the interpretation of this war, we need to look at two places in the Bible. The first place is in the portion of Lech Lecha, in the book of Genesis, and the second is in the book of Deuteronomy, 400 years later. And there we see that the Torah actually tells us that in the Middle East, in the area of the land of Israel, there was a corrupt and depraved culture. There were all kinds of nations that were corrupt. They were called by derogatory names. The Emim, the Zamzumim, the Rephaim, the people of Peri. There are all sorts of ancient writings called the Cave Scrolls. In the ancient world, the Emim would curse all these wild nations because they truly were wild nations. And the First World War of the four kings against the five cleared the Middle East of these cultures, making way for the Abrahamic cultures. God removed from here all the evil nations, and in their place, through a long process starting with the First World War, he brings in nations that he desires, giving them a chance. The Ammonites, the Moabites, who are descendants of Lot, Ser and Edom, who are descendants of Esau, and the new Philistines. In the book of Deuteronomy, it is written that in the coastal plain there lived a people called the Avim. The fathers were with a cow. A more civilized people came from Cyprus, Kaftor, Cyprus, and drove them out. This is a people who knew how to make treaties with Abraham, our forefather.
The second thing, what I want to bring out for you, after all, Abraham, he made Isaac his legitimate heir in the land, and the sons of his concubines he sent to the east.
And according to my research, the east means he sent them to China and India. In fact, in India, there is a caste called the Abrahamians. Abrahamic is the theme of Abraham, and they are actually in the lowest rank there in terms of their status. And it's the same in China. That is, Abraham's attempt to spread the calling, to spread Judaism, was not limited to the land of Israel, but he sent them to countries with millions of people where they were supposed to have an influence on those lands.
Yes, and even if we don't go that far, even if we say that he only sent them to more eastern regions, still within the Middle East, that's already a huge expansion.
And the Torah calls Abraham the father of many nations. So, in the books of Genesis and Deuteronomy, the Torah describes empires fighting over their interests. The Torah writes that the interest of the four angels in coming here is some kind of story of a rebellion between the five angels and the four angels. The Torah doesn't hide this. This is very important. The Torah does not ignore material considerations that all historians are able to recognize. It indicates that within this, there is a much more complete mechanism. And this mechanism is a process that no one in that generation saw. Even in that generation, they did see something. They saw how Abraham saved Lot. It really is a remarkable, formative story, one of responsibility. We live in a world of hostages, a world of rescuing hostages, and a world in which hostages must be saved by decisively striking at the forces of evil. All of this is written in the portion of Lech Lecha. But in the midst of things, you suddenly see a much broader picture. The Middle East is filling up with nations who believe they have a chance. And the Holy One, blessed be He, says, I am settling nations here, do not touch them. Do not touch the Edomites, do not touch the Moabites or the Ammonites, because these are nations whose cultures I am building upon, which perhaps might develop into something positive.
We'll see if that actually happens, right? Without digressing, Rabbi, let's go back for a moment to the story of the captivity and the hostages to really see what we can learn from this portion. Because I'm not sure everyone is familiar with all the details. I want to see the level of explain specifically what happened there and what we can learn from it regarding our children and the issue of rescuing the captive.
And we'll break it down in a moment, and then we'll see something amazing. The great global processes begin with small moral choices. And let's talk for a moment about Lot. Lot goes with Abraham, our forefather. He is Abraham's nephew. And he goes with Abraham, but they actually don't get along that well. They walk together, and then at some point they decide to part ways. Abraham, being a gentleman, tells Lot, choose where you want to be. Lot chooses to go to the region of Sodom, because it's an area with many springs. Everything is well watered, and that's where he wants to settle. This area then gets caught up in a world war between the four kings, who apparently come from the region of Mesopotamia, and the five local kings, who are apparently under Egyptian influence. In the course of this, they take Lot, all of Sodom, into captivity, including Lot. Abraham, who's a minor player in simple terms, he has 300 soldiers, 318 soldiers, and according to the sages, even fewer with a very small group, about the size of a small battalion, chases after the kings at night, surprises them. The element of surprise is extremely central in biblical warfare and frees Lot. Abraham, our forefather, takes a grave risk in order to save Lot and also his neighbors, the people who were taken captive by a violent group. This event is a formative one. That is, when we talk about the historical process, just one momenta historical process of a new Middle East filled with better days, this historical process, which takes 400 years to unfold, begins with a single moment of choice by our forefather Abraham to take responsibility for his captives. How can this be justified? How can this be justified? 315 soldiers against 4 kings? How does he manage to get in there, to return to the camp of the kings, to get Lot out of there? How can this be explained? Look, the Bible is a book full of such stories. Gideon too, with 300 men, wipes out a very large camp of Midianites. The Bible, it is clear that it is from the conference for such an event to divine intervention, help from heaven. But the help from heaven rests on our own great courage and on cleverness. That is, having the courage to come with such a small group and the cleverness to surprise them at night and so on. That's how it was with Abraham, our forefather. That's how it was with Joshua ben Nun. When Joshua came upon them suddenly, marching all night from Gilgal, that's how it was with Gideon, and that's how it was with the Maccabees. This is a model. There really is a legend. There truly is a legend about Rabbi Bechirut with his brother Mishlam Zu, who was sent to Rome with golden youth. To give a gift, it's worth knowing the story. Yes, let's tell it for a moment, but it's a very complex event. The sages, I think they have parables in our legends.
First, the legend tells the story, and then I'll offer some historiographical interpretation of this legend. There is a verse in the book of Isaiah that says, "Who has stirred up one from the east, whom righteousness calls to his feet? He gives nations before him and tramples kings underfoot. He makes them like dust with his sword, like driven stubble with his bow."
We'll return later to this verse and its original meaning. The sages, regarding this verse, told the story. Abraham, our father, had special ashes, so he would throw the ashes at the angels, and they would turn into swords and arrows. And then the story goes that there was a very righteous Jew who, whatever happened to him, would always say, "This too is for the best. This too is for the best." One day, he was sent to the Roman Empire to give them precious stones and jewels. And on the way, the precious stones were stolen from him. He stayed overnight at some inn, and they stole the precious stones and filled the bag with ashes instead. He arrives at the king, and it's very dangerous to come before the king with a chest full of ashes. The king could get very angry. In fact, he was very angry and wanted to kill Menachem Ishkamzu. Then Elijah the prophet appeared, disguised as a minister, and said to the king, "This is the ash of Abraham, our forefather. When you throw it at your enemies, it turns into swords." And throughout this whole ordeal, Menachem Ishkamzu remains unfazed. Whatever happens to him, he says, "This too is for the best." Indeed, they throw the ashes, and it turns into swords. And afterwards, the innkeeper said, "Wow, we have such special ashes in our inlets. Bring our ashes to the king." They brought the ashes, threw them at the enemies, but nothing happened, and they were killed. That's the story of Kazakh. I think this story is a parable. That is, I think the ashes of Abraham, our forefather, what are ashes? Ashes are our reality, something as common as sand. You encounter it everywhere, our material reality. The sages meant to say that when Nachum Ishkamzu looks everywhere and says, "This too is for the best," it turns the ashes into swords. In other words, reality itself becomes part of the divine purpose. And what we just spoke about regarding Abraham, our forefather, is turning ashes into swords. In other words, there is a world war that has nothing to do with Abraham, our forefather. There are such wars all the time, every day. Wars between nations over interests. And the consciousness of this too is for the best, meaning that even this is directed by the Holy One. Blessed be He, turns these ashes into swords. This really essentially conveys the great importance of what we are doing right now, what you and I, Amnon, are doing at this moment, turning ashes into swords. We are looking at historical, global, straightforward processes, truly seeing the hand of God. And in that itself, it truly becomes a divine event. The interesting thing is that this verse in Isaiah originally was said about the different global phenomenon, the expansion of Assyria into the land of Israel. And Isaiah, the prophet, says, "Look who did this." This is the meaning of the chapter. May his sword be as ashes, like a fire that burns like a firewood. In fact, in my opinion, in this story, we are given a key and told that when you see the hand of God within the story, you will truly transform the story into part of the divine trend. If we go back to Abraham, our father, then we see a very interesting event. Abraham, our father, transforms the event of this world war into a formative event in a historical process spanning 400 years, during which the entire Middle East was filled with sympathetic nations, with moral nations, with nations from whom we have moral expectations. God would give them 800 years of opportunity for moral growth together. And this is the divine plan. until the spread of the ox. There would be several countries in the Middle East, country soul, civilized, all descendants of Abraham, our forefather. They would work together so that his influence would reach its peak in the days of Solomon, and they would fill the world with the knowledge of God. This event is suspected to be the end. As we approach the end of our session, our half hour, I'd like the Rabbi to summarize exactly what we've seen and where we're headed in the next episode. What we discussed is that the Bible is full of global, worldwide events whose external side is full of interests and wars, and the Bible reveals within them divine trends. And since the Bible is a book that deals a great deal with such events, we have the opportunity to peek into the workshop of the creator of the world as he reveals it to the prophets, to see the considerations, the systems of considerations, and to learn about them. What is the toolbox? This study can also teach us about processes that we are witnessing today. Again, every process has its own uniqueness. Every process has its own nature. But when you know the creator and his toolbox, it opens our eyes to much broader and changing processes. We have a lot to learn from this. We specifically learned about the first process, the real World War I, the War of the Four Kings against the Five. And this war, we saw two things. First, that the war appears from the outside to be about external interests. But in reality, it was the beginning of a 400-year process of settling the Middle East with better nations, replacing the white peoples who were there. And the second thing is that the driving force behind the process is Abraham's decision to conduct himself in this event with a super moral and profoundly deep sense of responsibility for the captives. Our small choices as descendants of Abraham in how we deal with captives are a very significant part of the question of where the entire global process will go. Later on, we will see more processes and more meanings, as well as our role as interpreters of these processes and how we can also give meaning to them in a creative way. If you look closely and give meaning to the process will truly become one of divine significance. It's a pleasure talking with you. There was a sense of formality in the discussion. We're already looking forward to the next program to hear more details show the creator of the teacher works and motivates us. This is an understanding that can also strengthen us, especially in the difficult reality we are in. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Shabbat Shalom. Shabbat Shalom.